being good enough is not good enough. Like if you have a good enough company, it's going to be extremely difficult to raise. And so now it becomes a question of how do you become great? I love what we do at Techstars. And at the same time, it's hard. But if it wasn't hard, I would probably push myself to get to a level where it becomes hard again. There's a lot of amazing entrepreneurs around the world that don't even know that entrepreneurship would really be an opportunity for them, that don't really know how to access capital, that don't really have the network that they need to be really successful, because no one succeeds alone.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Fintech Leaders, coming to you from New York City. I'm your host, Miguel Armaza, and I'm a co-founder of Gilgamesh Ventures, a venture capital fund that backs early-stage fintech entrepreneurs in the US, Canada, and Latin America. If you enjoyed this conversation, I invite you to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows so more people can learn about fintech leaders. In this episode, I sit down with Maëlle Gavet, CEO of Techstars, a premier global accelerator and one of the world's most active pre-seed investors. Techstars was founded in 2006 and has backed almost 4,000 companies with a combined portfolio market cap of $105 billion. Some of their invested companies include Remitly, Chainalysis, DataRobot, and Alloy. We discuss trends and lessons learned at Techstars after 16 years, countless programs, and having backed 9,000 founders. Maëlle's criticism of the venture industry and how it could improve to better serve founders, how Techstars has been able to scale internationally and across programs with a partially decentralized approach, a deep dive into Maëlle's impressive background as a former founder and operator, and a lot more. Maëlle Gavet, welcome to Fintech Leaders. We're probably talking from a few blocks away in New York City, but we're doing it remotely. Thank you for joining. How's your week going?
Hi, Miguel. Thanks for having me. Weeks is going well. I think I started getting a little cold, like pretty much everybody in New York. But other than that, all good.
So, Mel, I want to hear a little bit of your background before we get started, because you've lived so far a very interesting life, and you're still very young. So I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot more interesting things come from you. But I want to hear about your background, but in the context of what has driven you, right? What drove you when you were, a college student or even earlier, a teenager, a kid, and what drives you today?
I come from what you would call a low middle class family. So enough money to pay for education and having a roof over your head, but not a lot more. And my grandparents were peasants, and my grandfather taught me very early on. He had this say, in French obviously, but he had this say that nothing worth doing is ever easy. And I think I learned at a very young age that you had to work hard to make things happen. And so what drove me and continue to drive me, I don't think I have changed much from that perspective, is I love to learn. Like I'm curious. Like there is always something new. And that's why I love my job at Techstars, because I get to meet so many entrepreneurs, like literally thousands of them every year. And they all have this really interesting idea. And more often than not, I've actually never thought about the world the way they think about the world. And I have never thought about the solution that they're pushing the way they're thinking about it. And so that, to me, the desire to learn is number one, has always been number one. And then the second one is this idea that you need to focus on doing the impossible. Like, again, back to my grandfather, nothing worth doing is ever easy. That transformed itself for me into like, let's look at what people think is not possible to do and let's try to do it. And again, that hasn't really changed from the time I was 7-year old to now, it's the same thing, learning and trying to make the impossible possible.
You left France after college and you worked in many, many countries, France, India, South Africa, the UK, even Russia, and now, of course, the US. Of course, I'm sure you took away a lot of lessons from living in those cultures. But why leave? France is not a small economy. Why not stay?
I think the first reason was I was an entrepreneur at heart. And growing up in France at the time, and it has changed dramatically. I can't emphasize enough how much it has changed. But growing up there, when I was 16, I built my first business when I was 16. Being an entrepreneur was not considered a good thing. Like going and working for the government was, becoming a civil servant was. And so there was a moment where I saw opportunity outside of France, and that's what led me to go and do something else somewhere else. And then I got the bug of discovering other culture, other environment, and trying to find a place for myself in this different culture, because I was learning so much. And so back to what we were discussing a few minutes ago, I love learning, and there is nothing more, that is nothing that drives learning as strongly as moving into another completely different environment and trying to adapt to it. It's like a forcing mechanism almost to learning. And I love that. I loved that for many years, and I continue to love it, even though I've been in the US now for 8 years, and I really enjoy being here. So I found other way to keep learning while staying put.
So I empathize with you a little bit. I also have lived in many countries and across cultures, and I always found that people like me, like us, who were good at adapting, they had some edge, right? They found their thing that helped them break into a new culture, right? For example, sports. Many people play sports, and that's how they connect. Or those that play the guitar always did well, right? Because everyone understands that. What was your edge? How did you adapt to all these very different cultures?
I don't think I'm a very cool person. I don't play guitar. I play some sport, but I'm pretty bad at it. And I don't have time to watch it. So I'm not sure I'm the cool person in the room. It was mostly through business. It was just every time there would be a new opportunity that would open up in another country, and I'd be like, oh yeah, that sounds cool. Let's go. And I would connect with people through the business, like, hey, this is my idea. What do you think about it? What do you think we could do together? And I always tried, more or less successfully, but I always tried to think about it from the angle of, what can I do to help support the community that I'm now being part of? It's not like I'm not coming as a know-it-all and look at all my experience and now you're going to see the light. It was more like, hey, there's something fascinating about your country, about your culture, about your community. I'd love to be part of it. And I'm thinking about this and this and this and this. What do you think? And would that be helpful? And to some extent, again, this is what I love about Techstars is it's a company that historically, the company is 16 years old, and I joined 3 years ago. So there's a lot of history before I joined. It's a company that had pretty much the same approach, which is, hey, we think that there's a lot of things interesting to do in this particular region, in this particular country. Here's what we bring in our baggage with us, like a bit like the Mary Poppins bag. Like, here are all the things that we can bring. Is there anything that you think could be useful, and how can we best be part of that community? Techstars is a very community-driven company. And this is to a large extent, as I say, why I love this company, because it was very similar to the way it is very similar to the way I was approaching entering a new country, whether it was India, South Africa, or the US.
I see a lot of books behind you. Is that also something you try to do? You try to learn through books about the companies you're dealing with, the countries you're working in, or anything else?
Yeah, I read a lot. Like, that's just a small part. There's even more.
And it's not a virtual background.
No, it's not a virtual background. And I'm just looking. Yeah, I did read all these books. I may not have finished them all because sometimes I'm like, meh, not worth my time. But like, I've opened every single one of this book and I read till the end, most of them. I mean, first I have a humanities background. Like I didn't go to an engineering school. I didn't study business. I literally studied literature and history and philosophy and basically all the humanities, a few foreign languages. And so books, and I come again from a family where books were like the critical part of our education. Like my parents have bookshelves which are basically taking the entire house. And so books have always been very, very important. And I think it's just such an unbelievable way to get into the brain of someone and get like the pure essence of it. And so I do read fiction and nonfiction. I read everything. Like I read anything that someone recommends. I will usually buy the book and start reading it, whatever the topic is.
Any favorite books from this year, or any one book
from this year? I don't know if I can say favorite, but the one that I've been reading, I'm not finished actually, is the Elon Musk biography. I thought that was quite fascinating to see how he's thinking through how he became who he is right now, and how a certain number of decisions were made, or he made certain decisions. So I thought that book was actually quite interesting. And then I read a few science fiction books. I like science fiction. And so not necessarily like new books. I reread a bunch of Asimov, which I think is brilliant. And I've read them already multiple times, more times than I'm going to admit. But yeah, I think it's pretty compelling, and it forces me to think about the world slightly differently.
Love it. So, Maëlle, before your current role at Techstars, I see a thread that you were leading, or you were in C-suite roles at e-commerce companies, whether it was retail, travel, or real estate. Why not continue in that operating role? What kind of convinced you to cross into leading a massive investing organization?
First, because I am a reformed entrepreneur and I like working with entrepreneurs. So that just, scratched an itch. I was thinking about maybe going and building a fourth business. So I think that's one. The second thing is actually my current role as CEO of Techstars is extremely operational, because we're a very different investor. Like we are the most active pre-seed investor in the world. And the way we do that is through very operational programs. Most investors, their business model is they source and select company, they invest in them, they may potentially take a board seat, but not always. And that's the process. Techstars, when we make an investment, first of all, we ask you to spend 13 weeks with us. That's generally publicly called the accelerators. Internally, we call that the entrepreneurship bootcamp. And this is 13 weeks deep in the trenches with us. Like, we have a team that is dedicated. These are small classes, 10 to 15 companies. So you get a lot of us on your back, and we run this program all around the world. We also, after you graduate from a program, we also provide a bunch of services. There's a whole series of services, from investor matching to helping you hire people, et cetera, et cetera. And so the business ends up being quite operational in terms of how do you manage that machine beyond just cutting checks to company. And we do that across multiple countries. We operate in 16 different countries around the world. And so all of that, while I am leading a pretty substantial investment firm, my role feels extremely operational. And then, as I said at the beginning, I love working with entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurs are magicians. They're the one who transform the world. Most of the time they make it better. Sometimes they don't, but in every cases they have a real impact on the world, and I love supporting them on their path to do that.
Yeah, it's certainly a net positive for the world. So I actually want to dig into that, because the venture capital industry is quite adverse to scale, right? I mean, we see Benchmark staying with 5 partners and no juniors, and then there's plenty of examples where your model breaks down if you scale, and there's many reasons. Whereas what Techstars has done is, you're challenging this aversion. You mentioned 16 countries, but I was looking through the list. It's several programs across cities, across several different verticals. So how are you succeeding at challenging this scale issue?
So first of all, we're not a venture firm. It's very important. We are one of the deal flow to venture, but our model is not a venture model. Second, the way we have structured our portfolio, again, is different from venture. What we built is almost like an actively managed index of early stage innovation. When you look at a fund like TSA 2021, which is our pre-seed fund deployed across North America and Europe, this is a fund that over a little over 3 years is going to be investing in over 900 companies, always at pre-seed, always on standard terms. And the model that we have deployed, that we have defined and refined over the years is really a model where we're creating, through that hyper diversification, low volatility for LPs. So we're not a VC firm, and I could speak for a very long time about the VC model and what's working and what's broken and what needs to be, in my opinion, reinvented. But again, that's the phase after us. What we are focusing on is we're basically a formidable deal flow machine, and we find entrepreneurs everywhere, and we help them. Or we try to help them. We try to help them be as successful as they can be. We try to give them an unfair advantage in the fight that is their day-to-day. Because again, as a former entrepreneur, I know what it is. It's like you constantly fight for everything. And what we're trying to do is to give them the best chance possible at winning. And so it's a very, very different model than the VC industry.
Quickly, I'm curious. So, being the most active and the largest seed or pre-seed investor in the world, you obviously co-invest with probably hundreds or thousands of firms. I don't want to talk about what's right, what's working, but what do you think needs to be improved, to your point, in the venture model?
Oof. A lot. I think the venture world is in dire need of reinvention. I think when money was practically free, we saw a lot of venture firms popping up like mushrooms with weak investment thesis, not a lot of experience either as an investor or as an operator who could potentially support the portfolio companies, and not a lot of, I'm going to call that infrastructure, but it's not even infrastructure. It's just like support, like not a lot of support. Like they would make an investment and then the founder wouldn't, there was not much behind it. So I think that's broken. I think that created an inflation on valuation. We're paying the price now. And when I say we, it's collective, and it touches founders because a lot of them are now in very difficult situation because the habit that they built over the years to be able to fundraise on a regular basis and to do that at either raising valuation that were pretty disconnected from the actual financial reality of the business is coming back hard on a lot of them. And it's fundamentally unhealthy, again, for many reasons that we won't have the time to explore today. So it's very clear that the way it's been operating for the last 20 years has a need to be rethought in terms of how do you support better the founders? How do you construct a portfolio that makes sense for your LP? How do you have venture firms that are truly accountable for the way they deploy the money? I think there have been multiple examples in the recent history where I think ALP really scratched their head on the due diligence process and what led certain venture firm to make investment decision pretty lightly with a very heavy checkbook. And so all of that to me, and it's also in the industry that is highly fragmented. This is pretty much the only asset class that doesn't have some kind of concentration. Like you can't say, oh, let's take the top 3 firms or the top 5 firms, and they represent whatever 60 to 80% of the asset class. I mean, you can do that pretty much across all the other asset class, and you will see that there is a pretty significant concentration in a few players' hand. That's not the case in venture, and I think there is an opportunity, a very big opportunity for disruption.
Let's talk a bit about the 16 years of Techstars. And I know I have several friends who either are working today for Techstars or have gone through Techstars. And I know that you track a lot of data and you look for learnings, right? About companies, about founders. Would love for you to share some of those learnings that you institutionally at Techstars have found throughout the almost 2 decades at this point.
Yeah. So we're a very, very data-driven company. We try to track everything that we can, from sourcing to application to what's happening during the program to what's happening after the program. I would go as far as saying we're probably one of the very few truly data-driven investor in the world because we collect so much data. I think there's a lot of investors who would like to be data-driven, but they don't have the database to do that. So I think what we've seen is there's very clearly a new wave of entrepreneurs out there. The reasons are multiple. One of the biggest driver is, I think, both COVID and the layoff that happened in the tech industry have created a large group of people who suddenly started thinking, hey, maybe I should be an entrepreneur. You combine that with some very interesting changes in the tech ecosystem around AI, blockchain, nanotechnology. Like there's a lot of things happening that are converging and that create this almost golden age of like, oh, we thought that frankly after the iPhone, we kind of all had invented everything. And that's like, oh, look at that. There's a new paradigm, technology shift. And that's awesome. Let's just like new business can be invented on the basis of that. And we see it in the application to Techstars. Like they've more than doubled in 2023, and that's to a large. I want to believe that this is because we're awesome and we've done so much great work, but it's also because out there's an increase in the number of entrepreneurs, and I find that pretty phenomenal. I think the second thing that we've seen, and I don't think that's going to surprise everyone, but like we have the data again to back it up, is there is clearly a lot of new businesses at early stage which are driven by the recent development in AI and machine learning, generative AI being only one of them, or one application, but there's clearly a lot. And we have close to 4,000 companies in our portfolio now. Well over 1,000 of them use AI or machine learning as at least a component of their business or operation. And when we look at our application, that number is growing. And we're pretty good at figuring out whether AI is a buzzword that you're using just because, AI, like this is the hip word of the day. And so that's the reason why you're using it. versus, no, actually it's a key part of your business model, versus you're actually working on an AI infrastructure type of business. And depending on which category we put you in, we are going to be more or less interested in what you're doing. But what we see very clearly is a growth in all three categories. So yes, there's a bunch of people who are talking about AI because that's fashionable these days. Fine. But there's also a lot of people who are reinventing either old business or new-ish business, like the business that have emerged in the last 10, 15 years through tech, through the internet, and then the mobile web. And now with AI, they're just like, oh, there's a way to reinvent what had been done by all these tech companies. And then you have a third category, which is also on the rise, which are all the businesses which we call AI infrastructure type of business, which are the one, enabling better data storage, because to be an AI business, you need to have an incredible data set. And it's just one example, but there's a lot of things happening also around the infrastructure required to power AI in the future.
I'm curious, if you look at the numbers and the classes of founders from 2020 and 2021 versus today, has it gotten easier for Techstars to attract founders given where the market is today, or do you think that doesn't matter too much?
It never feels easy because we want the best. And we spend a lot of time in sourcing and selecting these founders, and our investment thesis has always been historically that we think that talent and great ideas are evenly distributed around the world, but opportunities is not. And what it really means is that there's a lot of amazing entrepreneurs around the world that don't even know that entrepreneurship would really be an opportunity for them, that don't really know how to access capital, that don't really have the network that they need to be really successful, because no one succeeds alone, that may not have the toolbox or may not have the full toolbox required for them to be a successful entrepreneur. And we think, and I've demonstrated to our LPs, that actually there is money to be made by finding this founder and help them be successful, helping them make money. And in return, as investor, we also make money, and our interests are very aligned with the entrepreneurs. And so we purposefully go after a pretty robust sourcing process and selection process, because then we spend a lot of time talking to them and in multiple occasions until we make the final decision. So I don't think it has gotten easier. It is true, nevertheless, that through a mix of Techstars becoming more and more mature in the way we source and select, and the market right now pushing a new wave of entrepreneurs. We've just talked about why. And then the fact that you cannot anymore as an entrepreneur, raise money just on the back of a napkin. And there were truly times like that. I think when I say that, some people think that I exaggerate, but I have personal example, like people I know who raised money at dinner and they basically drew their business plan on a piece of napkin and they got a check. I don't think you can do that anymore. And obviously that's the most extreme variant. But what it means now is that being good enough is not good enough. Like if you have a good enough company, it's going to be extremely difficult to raise. And so now it becomes a question of how do you become great? And you may not need Techstars. Like, just to be clear, we're not like the only solution and it has to be Techstars or like you're never going to be successful. It's not that. It's just Techstars is one of the options that you can have as an entrepreneur to increase your chances of success. And we're pretty public about our statistics on that. Like we are objectively helping startups be more successful. And so it's a tool. And as a result of that, because it's harder to raise money, we do have more applications. So from that perspective, it's gotten a little easier, I would say, to do sourcing. Selection is still super hard.
But must have been a really nice napkin. So putting aside, obvious factors like of undesirability, are there types of founders that you think should not apply to Techstars, that are not a good fit?
I think if you have already built a business and through that business built strong, successful relationship with investors who are going to be backing your next business, and you've learned a lot during that first business, I think you probably don't need Techstars. Like if you already know how to run a business and you have all the network and connection that you need to learn how to run your next business and get money, because again, it's to a large extent fundraising, and you have the connection in the industry because your business is in the same field as the first one, yeah, you probably don't need Techstars. Like, I don't think Techstars is for everyone. I don't think like every entrepreneur under the sun should be applying to our program. But the reality is that there's very few entrepreneurs who are in that actual situation. There's a lot of entrepreneurs, that's their first business, or it's not their first business, it's their second business, but their first business, they may not have learned that much for plenty of different reasons. Like their business may not have been successful and they still have learned something, or they may not have been successful and frankly, they just learned that they didn't know how to run that business. So very different situation. So experience varies. They may also now have built a relationship with shareholders, with investors who will be ready to finance their next endeavor. And they may not be connected to the industry, like the industry that they want to be in. I always use that same examples because I think they're pretty clear in people's mind. If you want to build an e-commerce startup, we partner with eBay. Like as an entrepreneur, I would actually, if I was an entrepreneur again and I was building an e-commerce business, I kind of would love to be able to connect directly with eBay. And it doesn't matter if you're a repeat founder, like it's like, why would you not want that? Like if you work in space, like we have a partnership with NASA. Like, I don't know. I mean, if I was an entrepreneur in space, even if it's already my second company, I probably would want that opportunity to go and pitch NASA directly. And so I'm just taking the most extreme example, but I think the vast majority of entrepreneurs, the reality is that they don't have the network that would really make a difference in their success, and they can try to build it while they build their business, and some of them succeed. We can help with that dramatically. They, as I say, they may not have the full toolbox required. Like they may be a product genius, but they may be really bad at managing people. We can help with that. Or they may be, again, really good at product, but like really bad at go-to-market and marketing. We can help with that. They may have a great product and not know on which door to knock to go and raise funds. We can help with that. And so it's just, what I always recommend entrepreneurs is just think about the value proposition of Techstars and think about whether this is a value proposition that is attractive to you, whether it solves the problem that you need to solve right now. And if it doesn't, that's okay. Don't apply. It's all good. No, and we have this conversation very often when we recruit. And I have advised multiple entrepreneurs over the years to not apply. I was like, I don't think you need us. I don't think you're going to find that we help you get to the next level. And at the same time, I have also recommended to some entrepreneurs who were entrepreneurs with already quite a bit of experience. I was like, yeah, no, I think we can help you. And here's the reason why.
So let's zoom in a bit on your role and the structure of Techstars. Sounds like your role is highly operational. So I'm sure there's been a lot of standardizing, centralized, I'm sure some functions within the company. Maybe share a bit of that. Like what is centralized and what isn't, and what have you learned about it?
So the interesting thing is my professional life has allowed me to explore many different models, from the hyper-centralized to the hyper-decentralized and everything in between. And I came to the conclusion, sometimes painfully, that first of all, there's no one model. Like it evolves depending on the circumstances, the economy, etc. And then, but more importantly, that really the best is some kind of hybrid model where some is centralized, some is decentralized, and the challenge for any leader is to find that balance. And that balance by the way, back to my first point, is constantly evolving because of the nature of your business, potentially changing the needs of your customers, potentially changing the macro environment, potentially changing. And so it's this, I find that a lot of successful leaders are like this master in finding equilibrium for about 2 seconds. And then like equilibrium change, and they've somehow figured out very quickly how to refine that equilibrium between, again, centralized and decentralized. And so when I came to Techstars, there was in my mind this exact same approach, which is there are certain things that would probably benefit from being centralized, would be more efficient. So like when we think about doing sourcing, like doing a global campaign across the top universities, across multiple digital platforms, social media, about traditional media country by country is something that works pretty well when it's centralized. Making sure that, when you do, we have to do background check and legal checks. Because again, we deploy money from LPs, we deploy money from pension funds and from endowment. And so we're fiduciary responsible for that money. So we need to make sure that we're giving it to the right entrepreneurs and to the right startups. Like centralizing it in a process that like is very, very, very structured helps a lot. Like it cuts the time very much. And it's a much more friendly experience for the entrepreneur who goes through that process. When you go and want to every entrepreneur at some point is going to need to use some kind of HR system. Every entrepreneur at some point is going to need to talk to a lawyer. Every entrepreneur at some point is going to need to have some kind of accounting system, some kind of cloud services, we all have these needs. They don't always show up at the same time, but we all have at one point or another these needs. And if you're alone, you have to figure out what is the service, then you have to negotiate. And you're tiny little customers, you're not going to be able to negotiate much. At Techstars, we centralize the need of 4,000 companies. So when I myself or my team pick up the phone and talk to one of our partners, it's not us. It's like the 4,000 companies that we have behind us. And we're like, yeah, we think you can give us better rates than that because we're bringing that book of business to you. And that's the negotiation that it means that we selected the partner, and that means that we negotiated better rates. And that's only possible because of the centralization and the scale. So again, that's the reason why centralization to some extent on some functions actually makes sense. But then there's a lot of things that you want them to be decentralized. You want them to be unique and customized. And a lot of our programs are like that. Like, again, our class are like 10 to 15 companies. And we want that customization. We believe that the cookie cutter approach is not the way to do it. Because every entrepreneur has a different background, has a different set of challenges, has a different set of opportunities, and we need to be able to adapt. So there's to use the university metaphor, there's some kind of core curriculum that we want you to get because we think that's going to be helpful. And that tends to be a little centralized, but everything else is just how can we adapt to the market, the entrepreneur, the business, etc. And that is to a large extent centralized, which is why when you look at Techstars, we have so many programs, and sometimes that can be confusing. I know for a fact because it was very confusing for me at the beginning. But that's also the strengths of the model, which is partially centralized and partially decentralized.
What do you think is the most challenging part of your job?
Where do I start? I think that going back to the very first question you have asked me, and when I was telling you, I come from a family where I was told since I was 2-year-old, nothing worth doing is ever easy. I almost have this disease that if something becomes too easy, I'm like, I'm probably not working hard enough. There's probably a way to do it better. If it doesn't feel hard for me to solve the problem, I'm probably not pushing myself enough. And so I'm never satisfied. I always think that we can do better. And in maybe a slightly perverse way, I kind of like it. So I don't know how to answer that question. It's just I love my job. And I love what we do at Techstars. And at the same time, it's hard. But if it wasn't hard, I would probably push myself to get to a level where it becomes hard again. So too many topics to explore.
For someone that was trained in the humanities and literature, you almost have the mind of an engineer. You're seeking for problem solving.
I was very good at math, actually. It's just in France, if you do math, you also have to do biology. And I was so bad at biology. And I mean, like, beyond bad. And so at some point, I had to make a decision because I was in the top of my class for math, but I was at the very bottom for biology. And it was very clear that I wasn't going to be able to succeed that way. And I'm competitive. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll do humanities. That's all good. And that, by the way, it's one of my small regrets is that I really liked math. My father, who is 80, in his spare time, which he has a lot now, has math books and he does math problems. So I was raised by that kind of brain. And that's one of my regrets is I think if I could do it all over again, I would probably try to figure out a way to combine the two, because when I switched to humanities, I kind of give up on the math part of my education.
Speaking of math, how have you integrated some of the latest Gen AI enterprise tools at Techstars?
So there's the part which is like the investment that we're doing. We talked about it before, like well over 1,000 of our company using that. But I think your question is more about how we use it. We use it actually quite a lot, and we've been using it for quite some time, way before it was in fashion. You know, like I was mentioning earlier, when we talked about centralization, this question of when you have to review hundreds, if not thousands of, applications and legal entity, because we're gonna make an investment in the startup and we invest in a legal entity, we use AI to review a lot of them, like, because it's a great way of flagging abnormality or language that we need to focus on or things that don't fit well. Same thing with the selection process. The final decision is done by a group of humans, but we receive thousands and thousands and thousands of applications and of very uneven quality, I would say. And so we use AI to eliminate the application that, you know, are not final. Like it's clear it's missing some questions. It's it's barely like a sentence per question, etc. Like we basically, it's a great way to use AI, and so we use it quite a bit. And then we're in the process of looking more specifically around how to use AI to leverage the incredible knowledge that we have in terms of, like, we have 4,500 active mentors, and they created a ton of content, and we have a bunch of alumni as well. And so, like, how can we started testing, how can we use generative AI to basically mine through this data and through this content and be able to answer any question that our alumni would have instantly, rather than to wait for a human being to come and answer. We are increasingly looking at that as a way to identify our best portfolio companies, et cetera, et cetera. So we see AI as a massive opportunity to be an even better investment business and to be an even better supporter of entrepreneurs as they open their door to us and welcome us into their world and trying to help them as much as possible.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time. No matter who I talk to, business leaders across the totem pole, across industries, everyone is kind of in the process of discovery of how can they apply these new tools to a specific process of their business, which is absolutely fascinating. Maëlle, before we run out of time, you've been in New York for 8 years. What's your favorite part about the city? What do you like the most about it?
Oh, I like the food. I like the theater. I'm not a big fan of musical, but I like pure theater. There's some amazing things here. I like the fact that I can walk everywhere and there's a subway. And I think New Yorker maybe take that for granted, but I lived in plenty of cities where there is very little public transportation. And I think that's pretty amazing to live in a city where you can take public transportation pretty much anywhere. That's 3: food, theater, and public transportation.
Yeah, I mean, those are huge. Any favorite restaurant?
too many, too single. That's the problem. I'm a foodie. I like everything. So it's just like, and there's so much choice here. So no, I don't have a favorite restaurant. That's my problem actually. So when we need to go out for dinner, I'm like, there's these 25 restaurants that I like to try, and like, which one should we go to?
Well, Maëlle, thanks for dedicating all this time. There's plenty of entrepreneurs listening and reading, and I have no doubt many of them will apply to so many of the different programs at Techstars around the world. So thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this great episode with Maëlle, CEO of Techstars. If you want more interviews, make sure to subscribe, follow, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. It helps and means a lot. And if you have any suggestions or thoughts about the show, just drop me a line on Twitter or LinkedIn. Signing off till next week, I'm your host, Miguel Armaza.